Multi-layer is just that. You got 2 or 3 zones contributing. A partial penetration might be if you've got a 100-foot thick zone and you just perforate the top 10 feet of it. You've got flow coming at you from a radial direction, but you've also got flow coming up. Slanted well bores, horizontal well bores. There's a number of models. So if we go back to the data set that we just looked at, I try to pick one of those models and make it fit the data. And here you can see I've picked this composite model where we've got one set of reservoir character around the wellbore and a second set further away from the wellbore. And what I'm trying to do is make my model, which are these red lines, fit the actual data. In this case, we've got a really good fit. And the theory being that if I can model what's happened in the past mathematically, then that model should be useful to forecast what the well will do in the future. Okay, so here we go back to the strip chart, and I superimpose the model backwards through the reservoir. So here you can see the red line going through. This is the flow period, coming back up through the initial shut-in period. Got a good match there, and not a good match during the flow periods. In a oil well, it will never match in the flow periods. In this area here, the reason being is the oil is not actually flowing to the surface. It's just stacking up in the pipe and creating back pressure. So the model will never match here. It will never match here. It should always match here and here. Anytime it doesn't, you need to figure out why it doesn't. This is the percent difference between the model and the actual. That'd be 0% difference there. So, essentially for the duration of the shut-in period, my model is, certainly within 0.1% of the actual data, which is a pretty good fit. It tells me that despite this 100-pound pressure drop that we saw from here to here, that my initial reservoir pressure is 1740, and my P star, which again is this final extrapolated pressure out here, what it'll build up to, is 1740. So we had a 100 psi pressure drop on the test, but if you extrapolate them both out to final, there's 1/10 of a psi pressure drop, which is not within the accuracy of the gauges. Okay, just one other thing. Let me go back to that one. You see up here a gas in place number. That is based on an arbitrarily assigned spacing unit. So for a gas well, somebody's going to ask me what the reserves in place are, assuming this model is right. So I'll say, okay, I'll just put 160 acres around this gas well. And with 160 acres and the thickness that you've told me and the water saturation that you've told me and the porosity, that's what the reserves will calculate up to. But it is not measured during the test. Okay, here's a production forecast based on that. So 160 acres. And here we have the existing skin. I mentioned that the skin number was fairly high at almost 3. And I've got it against 3 different flow pressures. This would be surface flow pressures, 100, 250, and 500 psi. The reason I'm doing this is to see if compression would do you any favors. So if you're going into a main line at 500 psi, your flow rate's going to be this lower one. It's going to come in, about 200 a day, and after 3 months it'll be down to, maybe 130 a day, and over here you'll be at, something below 120 a day 6 months later. If we drop the pressure down to 100 by installing a big expensive compressor, maybe we'll go from 130 to 150 a day. After 6 months, we're at 115 a day up to 130. So it's not going to make that much difference to you by installing that compressor.
Where'd you find that skin number? You said it was 3. Did that come off of?
It was. Yeah, I'd calculated that back on the derivative curve. Okay. You want me to go to it and show you?
Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, doggone it. Yeah, I got to go back one.
That's right.
Yeah, it's back there. That came off of these calculations here. It's just not displayed. Okay, now here's the same production forecast with no skin. And just eyeballing it, there's not just a whole lot of difference. It's a little bit better. I think this scale here was 120 MCF a day on the other one. Yeah, 120. So we're at 100 and maybe 30 after 3 months with the existing skin. So if you remediate the skin, you know, maybe you're at 140 MCF a day. So what this tells us is this reservoir is so tight that neither skin nor a stimulation job, I mean, neither compression nor a big stimulation job is going to bump this rate up to, you know, maybe you'd like to have it at 300. So no amount of compression, no amount of removing skin damage is going to get you even up to this 150 rate here. It's just a tight reservoir. Tight reservoirs don't respond well to compression or remediating skin. Okay. What we got? This is another example. There again, a quick look at it. There's no real heartburn over the final shut-in pressures. You know, they're 1297, 1291, that's okay. The oil rate, it tested about 60 barrels a day during the initial. The rate dropped to, you know, something over 40 barrels a day during the final. This was a case where oil prices were low at the time. They didn't like that rate there. They also had some rule of thumb that if you had some drop between here and here, that you know, you shouldn't complete it. So they actually wound up P&A-ing this well. Sometime later, another operator approached me with this chart and asked me to take a look at it. So I plugged the data in, and I'm looking at the derivative curve. So here's our PPD curve. Again, each point has to be lower than the one that precedes it in order for it to be valid. So these points here that are getting higher, that means that anything before this point right here needs to be taken out of the analysis. So I don't even look at that. Now what I do look at though is this derivative curve, and I don't know if you've got the other one there in front of you, but see how big this distance is between here and here? That's a qualitative look at skin damage. And you can see over here the skin is calculated at 7.5. That is a big number. That can really affect your production. You've got about 15 millidarcies of perm. There's our reservoir pressure at 1281. So the thing that jumped out at me is that, wow, this well was really skin damage during this test. That can account for some of that lack of productivity during the test. So we put it in the model, and what I wind up with is, there again, we had a bunch of data that wasn't valid for the test, so that's what these white squares, the white squares are anything that's not analyzed, the green squares are the ones that are analyzed. So during the valid portion of the test, you know, I go from 0.2% off to essentially right on. So that tells me that's probably a pretty good fit. This is the production forecast for that model, assuming 40 acres of drainage. Now, there's a big difference between an oil forecast and a gas forecast. The gas forecasts are very reliable, and I can forecast those out for 5 years based on a test like this. An oil forecast is not reliable past a couple of months, and there's several reasons for that. One is that if you produce it, you've got a virgin oil reservoir with no gas cap in it. If you produce it low enough that you create a gas cap, you take it below bubble point, then it's going to tend to flatten out. Well testing software doesn't allow for that change from above bubble point to below bubble point. It doesn't allow for a change in relative permeability. You've got a permeability to oil that you've calculated, but once you introduce gas to it, now you've got two-phase flow. You've got a gas permeability and a oil permeability. Well testing software can't account for that.